Hello, BookTube. Hope you all saw that Ben Sanders came back to BookTube, made a return video just the other day, uh, and chose for his return video a discussion, and a very simple discussion too, that gets right to the heart of what we do here. What makes a book good? Is it the characters? Is it the pacing? Is it the plot? Is it your ability to identify with anything that goes on? Is it the quality of the writing itself? And I thought it was fascinating, and I've been glad to see that people have been weighing in the comments field. I'll link the video down below. You should weigh in on the comments field yourself. And I thought I'd make a response video of my own, especially since uh, one thing that you could see from Ben's video is that on BookTube still, and probably forever, book means novel. But there are lots of other books out there that aren't novels. So I thought I would make a response video about nonfiction. What makes a work of nonfiction good? And it's a gigantic subject, of course, so I'll stick just with my favorite genre, biography, and outline a few basic ways that you can sort of kind of map what makes a biography good. And it's a few simple questions. You start with, who is it written for? Because that will govern the brief of the person who's writing it before they ever set pen to paper. And it can be done wrong. And the misjudging of author and audience will ruin a thing right from the beginning. Picture, for instance, one of those, 30-page bobble-headed kids books. Who was Eleanor Roosevelt? Who was Amelia Earhart? You see them in the children's section of your Barnes & Noble. Imagine if one of those, about Martin Luther King Jr., for instance, where you reach page 10 and the caption at the bottom says that Martin Luther King missed his appearance at City Hall that day, probably because of an outbreak of scorching herpes. Well, okay, that author has failed. That author has failed to write a book for the designated audience. And the same thing is true if, let's stick with Martin Luther King Jr. If Henry Taylor Branch, for instance, had done an entire chapter on Martin Luther King's dealings with Fidel Castro, and all of it was misread from the evidence and the documents, and all of it could be torn apart, well, that would be a drastic misstep on the part of the author in judging his audience, in thinking that nobody would know, or in not knowing himself. So the first thing you want to do is figure out, who is this for? So if you find a new biography of somebody that interests you, and it's short and simple, well, then it's probably not for you. If you already know enough, then it's going to be a waste of your time to read it. And you might spot flaws that the book knows it has and isn't troubling to fix because it's being pitched at a level of expertise that's not going to care about little flaws one way or another. The next simple question to ask is, who's it written by? Who is this person? When we talk about biography, I think I've mentioned on this channel before, there are generally speaking two types of publishing biographers. There's the hired gun, who will move on from one town to the next, and they know how to amass material, and they've got a really good turn of phrase, and they've got a publisher who knows that they do reliable work, that their volumes will move. With a professional publisher like that, a professional biographer, you don't get the sense that they're moved by passion about their subject ahead of time. They might develop a passion as they're researching. I've seen that happen many times. But somebody who does a 300-page biography of Marie Antoinette 1 year, and then 2 years later does a 300-page biography of King Edward I, no connection between them whatsoever, subject-wise. What things can you reasonably infer from those books? One of them is that the author came to their subject relatively cold, much the same way you would. No specialized knowledge ahead of time, in other words. And two, the second reasonable inference you can make is if they can churn out a 300-page biography of Edward I only 2 years after they did 300-page biography of Marie Antoinette, then their biography of either can probably be rightly suspected of being a bit shallow, a bit simple. And usually, what you will find, it's been my experience, that when you look at one of those books by such an author and go to the bibliography and the works cited, you will see far more secondary sources than primary sources. That makes sense, right? If you're writing about King Edward I, you're going to, and you have a contract with your publisher for it to be due in 10 months at 300 words. You're probably not going to board a plane to Dulwich or wherever and teach yourself medieval Latin. You're probably not going to do that. So you're going to trust scholars who have done that, and you're going to cite their works rather than the originals, unless you're a big fat liar. I have caught my share of those where they cite the original works, but they haven't really consulted the original works. They've consulted authors who consulted the original works and sort of left them out of the equation to make it look like their bona fides are steeper than they are. And the way that you will always catch such a liar is that they will reproduce mistakes on the part of the scholar whose credit they're removing. Someone who knows the original work will say, well, you certainly didn't get it from there. You had to get that from somebody who made that mistake about it. And who was that somebody? It's a very simple process. You see it happen in the letters page of the Times Literary Supplement all the time. People getting caught at that sort of shady maneuver. And because a professional biographer can't do that kind of legwork, you're going to get the 300-page equivalent of a hot take. You're going to get, Marie Antoinette was actually a proto-feminist, something like that. And that line will be in the introduction and in the epilogue, and what's in between will be a fairly standard rehashing of well-known facts about Marie Antoinette. The other kind of biographer, the other answer to the question of who wrote the book, is someone who is steeped in that particular subject. And you can recognize that person in two different ways, usually, generally speaking. One, their book is enormous and has taken a long time for them to write. Their introduction, their prefatory material will say, it's been 15 years, it's been 20 years, or there'll be multiple volumes. Or the other way is that you look at their bibliography and you see that they've written 4 other biographies, standalone, single-volume biographies of the same person. And that's when you can make a couple of reasonable inferences from that as well. First, you can reasonably infer from that person is a genuine expert on the subject. They're not going to the library and pulling down, as the disgraced World War II historian David Irving used to tell a funny, biting anecdote about how those kind of biographers will go to the library, pull down 10 biographies written by other people, and write the 11th one from them, without ever going anywhere near the archives. And when you meet someone, a biographer who's done 300-page books on one person, probably you're not dealing with that. Probably you're dealing with someone who has assiduously sought out every single last scrap of documentation and mastered it. And I'm not saying that either one of those is inherently better or worse than the other, but it gets back to the question number one. Who are you when you're reading this book? When you go to a bookstore or your library and you're thinking, I want to know more about Charles Lindbergh, you have to gauge how deep your interest is. So you can go to the library for Charles Lindbergh, for instance. You can go to the library, you get Scott Berg's gigantic 600-page biography that it covers every bit of ground, goes over every last primary source and every incident in Lindbergh's life in enormous detail. Or you can get something much shorter than that, that's still responsible. But then the third question that you want to ask about a biography, to see whether or not it's a good book, whether or not it's a Ben Sanders kind of good book, is what was it written with? Which kind of ties in with what we were just talking about. If what armament did this writer bring to bear? And that's not just a question of what primary sources they consulted and mastered, although that's crucially important, especially the further back in time you go. or in the present day, the more voluminous the primary sources are. I have lost count of how many times, for instance, I have read a biography of Richard Nixon, who left an extremely voluminous written record behind, where the author makes a statement, sometimes flies with it for a paragraph or even a whole chapter, that simply is contradicted by Nixon himself or by primary documents that cannot be gainsaid. And the only reason it's in the book is because the author didn't know that. Because it's this vast amount of material and they just didn't cover it all. There's that. But there's also one other key thing when reading a biography, and that is, in terms of what did they read it, what did the author write it with, and that is, did new documents come to light? Now, it's all the rage now. You'll hardly pick up a big, especially from academic press, biography that doesn't say somewhere in its cover material that it's using new or previously underutilized sources. That's almost never true, but sometimes it is. And when it is, well, then you've got a whole bunch of ancillary research to do on your own. What is that extra source? And is it important? There was just comparatively recently a gigantic tranche of Napoleon letters that came to light and sparked a wave of new biographies. But if you go and look at what those letters are, they're fairly trivial. There's a lot of them, but they're fairly trivial. They're not bombshells. They don't shed any new light on anything. So you look at these new biographies and you have to determine, okay, well, if you're citing those letters as the reason you wrote this book, then I can ignore your book. If you were writing your book anyway and those came to light and you incorporated them into chapter 36, fine, that's a different story. But sometimes it can make a big difference. Sometimes it's rare, but it does happen. Sometimes a document will come to light, a primary source will come to light that is vital and that kind of invalidates all of the works that went before it, at least on factual grounds. And the extra factual grounds is the last main simple question to ask, which is one of the central questions that Ben asked in his video. How is it written? It's a simple question, but it applies to nonfiction as well as it does to fiction. I wish that more people got that fact. They might